1 minute lang. Ikaw naman. The 29th session of the Senate in the third regular session of the 16th Congress is hereby called to order. Can I request our colleagues to rise for a minute of silent prayer? Thank you. With the permission of the chamber, the chair declares a 1 minute suspension. The session is resumed. The Secretary will call the roll.
Roll call of members. The Honorable Senator Sangara, Aquino, Binay, Cayetano Alan, Peter Compañero S., Cayetano P.A.S., Defensor Santiago, Ejercito, Enrile, Escudero, Estrada, Gingona, Hunasan, Lapid, Ligarda, Marcos, Usmeña, Pimentel, Po, Recto, Revilla, Soto, Trillanes, Villar, Senate President Trillo.
14 senators are present. The chair declares the presence of the quorum. The acting majority leader is recognized, Senator Pia Cayetano.
Mr. President, I move that we dispense with the reading of the journal of the 28th session, September 29, 2015, and consider the same as approved.
Any objection? Hearing on the reading of the journal of the previous session is hereby dispensed with and the same hereby approved.
Mr. President, we'd like to acknowledge our visitors. We have the barangay captains from Cagayan de Oro, members of the women organization movement in the Bangsamoro headed by Ruby Andong, and the marketing students of Polytechnic University of the Philippines headed by Mr. Ram Elep.
The students from Polytechnic University of the Philippines led by Mr. Ram Elip is recognized, and we make their presence of record and welcome them to the Senate. Likewise, the women's organization movement of the Bangsamoro led by Ruby Andong. We recognize their presence and make their presence of record, and the barangay captains of Cagayan de Oro.
Mr. President, I move that we proceed with the reference of business.
Secretary will read the reference of business.
Bill on first reading, Senate Bill number 2974, an act instituting income tax reform for individual and corporate taxpayers, amending for this purpose sections 24A, paragraph 2, 27A, and 35A of the National Internal Revenue Code of 1997 as amended for other purposes, introduced by Senator Recto.
Ways and Means.
Resolutions. Proposed Senate Resolution number 1598, directing the proper Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the Commission on Audit report that the National Housing Authority continued to use 665.118 million pesos under the Disbursement Acceleration Program despite the Supreme Court ruling declaring acts related to the use of the funds unconstitutional by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Committee on Finance.
5099, directing the proper Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the report that the Commission on Audit ordered government hospital officials to return a total of 21.9 million pesos and bonuses distributed to its employees in 2014 by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Health and Demography.
1600, directing the proper Senate Committee to conduct an inquiry in aid of legislation on the Commission on Audit report that the government service insurance system spent a total of 406 million pesos and unauthorized bonuses and unnecessary expenses in 2014 by Senator Defensor Santiago.
Government Corporations and Public Enterprises.
Committee report number 266, prepared and submitted jointly by the Committees on Justice and Human Rights and Finance on Senate Bill number 2973 with Senators Maria Lourdes Nancy S. Binay and Pimentel III as authors thereof, entitled An Act Granting Hazard Pay to all first and second level court judges during their incumbency and appropriating funds therefore, recommending its approval and substitution of Senate Bill 2469, sponsor Senator Pimentel III.
To the calendar for ordinary business. The Majority Leader.
A minute suspension, Mr. President.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
With the consent of the Senate, I move that we recognize Senator Lauren Legarda to speak on a matter of public interest.
Senator Legarda is recognized on a question of public interest.
Thank you, Mr. President. I deliver this speech as the United Nations had just adopted the Sustainable Development Goals that will govern the nations of the world in the next decade or so. We all dream of living in a progressive, peaceful, safe, and healthy community. We all hope to be able to fulfill our needs and to enjoy our basic human rights. But we live in a world far from ideal. There is poverty around us, hunger, inequality, injustice, violence, natural hazards, environmental degradation, and climate change. Nations sought to address these challenges through the MDGs, or the Millennium Development Goals, which were adopted by 189 member states of the United Nations in year 2000. In its 2014 report on the MDGs, the UN stated that extreme poverty has been reduced to half. 90% of children in developing regions are attending primary school. There have been significant improvements in healthcare, particularly in the fight against malaria and tuberculosis. Child mortality has been cut in half. The political participation of women has continued to increase. The target of having the proportion of people who lack access to improved sources of drinking water been achieved. In some of these goals, substantial progress has been made, but greater effort is required to reach the targets, particularly on ensuring environmental sustainability, eliminating hunger, improving child nutrition, reducing maternal mortality, and the 2014 report on the MDGs, the UN stated that extreme poverty has been reduced to half. 90% of children in developing regions are attending primary school. There have been significant improvements in healthcare, particularly in the fight against malaria and tuberculosis. Child mortality has been cut in half. The political participation of women has continued to increase. The target of having the proportion of people who lack access to improved sources of drinking water has also been achieved. In some of these goals, substantial progress has been made, but greater effort is required to reach the targets, particularly on ensuring environmental sustainability, eliminating hunger, improving child nutrition, reducing maternal mortality, and bringing down school dropout rates. According to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, the MDGs have made a profound difference in people's lives, but more needs to be done to accelerate progress. Therefore, on September 27, 2015, UN member states adopted a new set of goals for the next 15 years. These goals, known as the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, aim to build on the gains of the MDGs to fill in the gaps and address new challenges. Goal 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. We know that so well, Mr. President, because at least half of our 100 million population still live in impoverished areas. Goal 2, end hunger, achieve food security and improved nutrition, and to promote sustainable agriculture. This is one aspect, Mr. President, which we should focus on, being an agricultural economy. Considering the fact that many of our children drop out within the grade school or elementary years because of lack of nutrition, even because of lack of anything to drink or eat before breakfast or before even going to school. This is a very serious goal that we must meet. Third, to ensure healthy lives and promote the well-being for all at all ages. We have already enacted the laws benefiting our senior citizens. The challenge for us, Mr. President, is to be able to actually implement all the benefits for our senior citizens, not only in terms of medicine and health care, but also in terms of food and nutrition. Goal 4, ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. Just today, in the committee hearings on finance on the budget of the state universities and colleges, we've seen how the Philippines, as compared to other ASEAN nations, lags way, way below in terms of GDP per capita ratio of our contribution to educational institutions, especially in the tertiary level. While the Philippines only contributes 9% of our GDP to tertiary education, countries like Vietnam contributes at least 40% or 4 times of what the Philippines allocates for education. Goal number 5, Mr. President, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. We have done this again through legislation, but what we need to do is to create more parity and equality for women in our country. Goal 6, Mr. President, ensure the availability and sustainable management of our water sources and sanitation for all. This is a very important goal, Mr. President, especially because we are an archipelago, especially because we are also victims of El Nino, which is happening right now, till the next couple of months, till the first quarter of 2016. It is also very important to focus on sanitation, especially since many of our poor families living in the urban areas lack access to potable water, lack sanitation, lack all these basic amenities, which speaks of basic human rights. Even our evacuation centers, post-Yolanda, even evacuation centers, post-Zamboanga siege, evacuation centers, post-Al-Qadev killings, are not fully equipped with water sources and clean sanitation. Goal 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, and sustainable and modern energy for all. What you're seeing, Mr. President, is something so simple and sustainable. I wish we could have more lights made of indigenous simple materials like what you see on the video. This has been done in provinces like Sarangani, Mr. President. I'm certain that there are other simple technologies which can bring light to our remote barangays and even sitios, Mr. President. It is my dream, Mr. President, that by the end of this year, or perhaps even 2016, that all unelectrified sitios in the country can finally find sustainable and modern electrification. 8th, to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. This is a challenge for all of us, especially as we see underemployment and unemployment in our midst, despite the fact that we have already enacted laws to support employment, like the PESO law, which was recently amended, the Public Employment Service Office, despite the existence of many other laws that can provide self-employment, like the Go Negosyo, or the MSME law, or the Barangay Kabuhayan law. We are rich in terms of legislation and policy measures, Mr. President. What is lacking is for us to be able to implement all of these laws so we meet these SDGs. Goal 9, build resilient infrastructure, promote inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and to foster innovation. This is very clear in the infrastructure, and even as we pass and enact the General Appropriations Act, where a large part of it belongs to the Public Works Department and other agencies which build infrastructure. We must look at the resilience of all this infrastructure to make sure that the 20 or more natural hazards that come our way in our country will be able, that all of these infrastructure will be able to withstand the strength and the intensity of these infrastructure being built. Goal 10, reduce inequality within and among countries. In the run-up to COP21, this will be discussed on climate injustice, the issues of the rights of indigenous people, and the rights of many of the underprivileged and marginalized sectors in our community and among nations. This is a very important SDG, Mr. President. Goal 11, to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. We know that the issue of peace and order is something that is a concern not only of lawmakers and political leaders, but for every parent, for every child, for every human being living in this country. We have seen how there seems to be a breakdown in peace and order, in law and order, where in broad daylight we see killings which are unresolved and which just simply add into the list of unresolved statistics in our police blotters. This should not happen in civilized society, Mr. President. Goal 12, to ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. And we are supportive of this, Mr. President, to show that consumption and production does not only belong to factories, but even to the rural areas as well. Our arts and crafts should be sustainable and should be sustained. Goal 13, take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. Today, Mr. President, I believe the Climate Change Commission will finally submit the intentionally or the national determined commitments of our country. Many countries belonging to the UN have already, even the smallest nations, have already submitted their INDCs to the UNFCCC. I believe that the Philippines will soon, within this week, commit to the INDCs, and I hope that this will be taken seriously by the agencies of government, especially the transport and energy and environment and health sectors and agriculture sectors, so that we are able to combat climate change and its impacts. Goal 14, conserve and sustainably use the oceans, the seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Being an archipelago of 30 million hectares, our marine resources is much, much more than the 30 million hectares if you are to combine the exclusive economic zone and the marine protected areas belonging to these places, Mr. President. And so we know how rich our biodiversity is, not only in terrestrial landscapes, but also in marine protected areas. And what we need to do is to use it sustainably so that the next generations will not lose on on the gains and on the resources present in our generation, Mr. President. And Goal 15, to protect, to restore, and to promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, to sustainably manage our forests, to combat desertification, and to halt and reverse land degradation, and to halt biodiversity loss. We are such a wealthy nation with so much wealth, both in our terrestrial landscapes and in our biodiversity and in marine areas. There is no reason why our people should be poor if we sustainably utilize these terrestrial ecosystems. Goal 16, to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Goal 17, to strengthen the means of implementation and to revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development. These are very impressive and important targets that, if we are able to achieve them, we would make our commitments close to being ideal. But these goals require not only a lot of hard work, but also collective effort, collective action, and acceptance of every leader and citizen to be part of the change towards sustainable development. The first challenge to us is to adopt these goals in the Philippine context. There should be a national framework on how the SDGs will be incorporated in our development agenda, and these should be translated in our local plans. It is simple, Mr. President. Let us simply align our General Appropriations Act, which we are currently discussing in committee, and eventually will amend and later on adopt in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. Let us utilize the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, which we adopted in March in Sendai, Japan, so that both the SDGs and the DRR framework in Sendai will be able to make our communities more sustainable and more resilient. There is actually an interrelation among the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the SDGs, and the expected ambitious and legally binding climate change agreement in Paris this December. In order for development to be sustainable, we must ensure that it is resilient to natural hazards, is geared towards mitigating climate change, because a single typhoon or earthquake can undo years of development if we do not prepare and reduce disaster risks. The SDGs, therefore, should be an issue this coming elections, because the next president, vice president, senators, and local leaders of our country should embrace these goals. They should be part of the agenda. In fact, I hope that there will be constant debates of our local and national leaders to be able to make sure that our country and our local governments actually strengthen the implementation of these SDGs so that we would be more progressive, more peaceful, more safe, and healthy. Let us prove, Mr. President, that our nation goes beyond lip service, that we remain steadfast in our commitment to building a more resilient and sustainable planet through effective policies and urgent climate action. The path that we will take today will determine the fate of the next generations, starting with our very own children. Let us not fail them, Mr. President, and we should not fail them. I thank you for your time and for your patience, and I would like to encourage everyone present here today to make sure that in the deliberations of our budget this year, that we take into serious consideration the Sustainable Development Goals just adopted by our country and all other nations just recently in the United Nations. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. We'd like to thank Senator Loren for her privileged speech. On a personal note, I'd like to commend her for putting on record this latest set of goals, which is now known as the Sustainable Development Goals. It has actually been a concern of mine, and now that there are a new set of goals to replace the Millennium Development Goals, perhaps the sponsor would like to consider in the future, as this is my last Congress, looking into forming another committee to oversee this, because what I've noticed in my work on Millennium Development Goals is that it is spread out over many committees, and not to create another body to deal with, but more like to ensure that there is another committee within the Senate that I'm referring to that would ensure that the overlapping goals are accomplished. The lower house has actually put up a Millennium Development Goal Committee, but we never had such a thing. So the good senator might like to pursue that in the next Congress. This Congress, but then we only have a few working days left.
Yes, I leave it to the better judgment of the Senate President if this would be allowed. I would be more than happy to have such a committee if it would be allowed, if it's an additional committee, or perhaps whoever chairs the NEDA committee, over the oversight committee on NEDA, could be, so that also I would expect NEDA to craft their PDP, Philippine Development Plan for the next administration, because the PDP, I believe, expires in 2016. So the next PDP should be aligned with the SDGs for the next 15 years, which would cover 2 administrations. And as you noticed, Mr. President, Madam Senator, that in every hearing which we attend, we always ask them salient portions on the SDGs. And I recall in the DBCC last July, we already asked the Budget Office and the Department of Finance whether the NEP that they prepared were aligned with the soon-to-be adopted SDGs, which just happened 2 days ago. So what I'm saying is we should have prepared our NEP based on this. And if it was not, in doing our plenary debates and eventually amending the 3.002 trillion budget, we must align it one by one with all these SDGs. When you look at the health sector, let's see how. When we look at the budget of the Nutrition Council, how. When we look at the education sector, SUC's budget, UP, CHED, etc., let's see. In the DILG budget, how are you capacitating local governments? In the Climate Change Commission. So let us see. Perhaps we can have an SDG tagging in our budget which we pass, which should be an innovative way of seeing how relevant our budget is and how aligned it is with the Sustainable Development Goals. it is important, for example, that our energy sector actually aligns itself with one of the important SDGs. How do we combat climate change? How do we align the energy and transport sectors, which are the biggest polluters, which are the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions? And I will not accept the proposition or the argument that because we are not a major emitter, but because we are less than 1% or a 0.002 emitter, that we must not mitigate. It makes good business, economic, financial, health, and environmental sense that we actually mitigate and adapt, because mitigation is a function of adaptation. So, Mr. President, it is my humble suggestion, based on the statements made by Your Honor, that we actually climate tag, or better yet, SDG tag our budget. I know that perhaps the LBRMO will say, here she goes again, additional work. But this will be such a legacy budget, Mr. President, if we were able to climate tag the budget according to some agencies. They did climate and DRR tagging. Why doesn't the whole 3 trillion budget be SDG tagged, so that at least we know, we can tell our people we are aligned with the SDGs that we have adopted just 2 days ago? That is my suggestion. I don't think it's very difficult to see what we've done for the health sector, what we've done for education, so that it can also guide us in the 2017 NEP, the next government. No, it's still this administration that will do the NEP for 2017 in the budget call till March or April. And so, if we missed out in this budget, despite what tweaking we do, it is still not SDG aligned as much as we want it, then it could be something we can build on, so that by first quarter of next year, and you are still here by that time, then we can do a better NEP for 2017 for the next 6 years of the next president and the next administration. So I can see you nodding. I hope that I have your support for the not just climate tagging, but the sustainable development goal tagging of our budget.
Thank you,
I talk too much.
Senator Legarda. You have my support on the SDG tagging in my own capacity in the committees that I chair and the areas of interest that I have. I will be happy to take that initiative and to also help convince our colleagues that this is essential. It will actually make our work easier in the long run.
You're correct, Madam Senator, Mr. President. Pagtanungin po tayo ng tao, ano ang ginawa nyo para mapabuti ang kalagayan ng kalusugan ng mga musmos sa Pilipinas? Ito po ang aming inallocate na budget. Ito po ang implementing agency. Papanoorin natin kung paano nila i-implement. Tatanungin sa atin, paano nyo pinabuti ang kalagayan ng mga state universities and colleges? Ngayon nga ay 9% lang ang inyong pinorsyento dyan, ihambing mo sa Vietnam na 39%. Kahiya-hiya. Sasabihin natin, hindi, dinagdagan natin yan. Kaya sa 2017 NEP ay dadagdag natin para tayo'y on the same page or at par sa ating ASEAN neighbors. So it's a very good benchmark, the SDG tagging. And believe me, we can be a model budget for the world or even in Asia. If we do that, we'll probably be the first country where its parliament or its legislature actually tags its budget based on the SDGs. Just a humble suggestion if you agree.
Thank you, Senator Legarda. Mr. President, I move that we refer the speech of Senator Legarda and the interpellation or manifestations that this representation made to the Committee on Rules.
The speech is referred to the Committee on Rules.
With the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of House Bill number 5842 under Committee Report number 213. This is the bill on Social Security, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status is that the sponsor delivered the sponsorship speech last August 26. I thus move that we open the period of interpellation.
Period for interpellation is in order.
I move that we recognize the sponsor, Senator Villar.
Senator Villar is recognized.
I move that we recognize Senator Nancy Binay to interpolate or make a manifestation. Let's give her the floor. I move
On
that
the
we give her
period
the
of
floor.
interpellation, Senator Nancy Binay is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you,
Mr. President, I think there will be no interpellation on the bill. Senator Binay will just make a manifestation.
The chair has a few questions to clarify the measure.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Minority Leader, Senator Juan Ponce Enrile, requested this representation to read into the records his position on the proposed increase in the minimum monthly pension under the Social Security system. Manifestation of Minority Leader Juan Ponce Enrile on House Bill number 5842 under Committee Report number 213. Mr. President, at the outset, please allow this representation to categorically state that I have strong reservations against House Bill number 5842 under Committee Report number 213, which proposes an across-the-board increase of 2,000 on the minimum monthly pension under the Social Security System, or SSS, based on the following reasons. Number one, at present, there are about 1.9 million SSS pensioners. If this bill becomes a law, the 2,000 increase in pension will require an additional outlay of 49.4 billion a year, computed on a 13-month basis, considering that the SSS also gives 13th-month pension to its retirees and survivor spouses. For the year 2014, the total revenue of the SSS is only 44.5 billion, which is not even enough to cover the 49.4 billion requirement to fund the increase in pension. Because of which, even during the first year of implementation of this measure once passed, the SSS will already incur a net loss of 4.9 billion. Such loss is even expected to increase since there are about 90,000 retirees that are added every year to the SSS pensioners. Number two, without a corresponding increase in the premium contributions of its members, the SSS will have no recourse but to source such deficit from the Social Security Fund. Based on sensitivity studies and actuarial valuation done by officials of the SSS, House Bill number 5842, if passed into law, will undoubtedly shorten the fund life of SSS by 13 years, from the original projection of 2042 to 2029. The unfunded liability, or the difference between the projected fund and the projected benefits, will increase from 1.6 trillion to 2.7 trillion based on current valuations. Evidently, 2029 is still more than a decade away. But the very delicate question that all of us must consider is how do we responsibly address the needs of our present constituents while protecting the welfare of the future generations. Number three, the SSS officials have likewise expressed serious concerns about the fact that the schedule of Social Security contributions and the monthly salary credits as provided for under the SSS law is already outdated. The minimum monthly salary credit is still pegged at 1,000 pesos per month, while the maximum MSC is pegged at 16,000 per month. This range, number one, has not been modified considering that the minimum wage in the private sector has considerably increased over the years. And number two is no longer reflective of existing realities in compensation administration, labor relations development, and of current socio-economic condition. It is important to note, Mr. President, for the period of 23 years, across-the-board pension increases were implemented 19 times, whereas the contribution rate remained at 8.4%. Unfortunately, the current law prohibits the SSS from increasing the monthly contributions of members to fund any benefit increase. It was only in January 2014 that the SSS contribution rate was raised to 11%. Number 4. Lastly, in the event that the SSS itself can no longer ensure the viability of its fund and correspondingly its programs, the national government will be expected to step in and take on the burden of having to pay for the mandatory benefits or pensions of the SSS members and retirees. This scenario will certainly become a possibility if we continue to push for this measure, unmindful of its dire consequences. Considering the host of other problems the government needs, or in the case of the next administration, will need to address, does this Senate intend to add or create more? Having said all this, Mr. President, this representation respectfully submits that this proposed measure needs to be studied carefully, and further consultation should be made for a better understanding of the nature and current status of the Social Security Fund. The mandate of the SSS to provide meaningful protection to its members and their beneficiaries is anchored on the existence and the administration of a viable Social Security program. Such mandate extends to the entire SSS membership, now totaling to 32 million, and is not only confined to the 1.9 pensioners. At the end of the day, it is too risky to play around with the Social Security Fund by coming up with an additional pension increase without laying down the corresponding funding source or sources. Lest this representation be misunderstood, this representation would like to support any measure that will redound to the benefit of our people, such as this proposed increase in their well-deserved and much-needed pension. However, we must both be responsible enough, as I said earlier, to balance the interest and protect the welfare of both the present and future generations. Such responsibility, Mr. President, rests heavily on our shoulders. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Binay. The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, in view of the concerns raised by the Minority Floor Leader and after consultation with the Senate President, we move to suspend consideration to allow the body to consider the same, and His Honor the presiding officer has also asked for time to review the same.
What does the sponsor say?
Of course, Mr. President, our pensioners are waiting for this bill, and they really want this bill implemented, passed and implemented. But if you have some questions, then I will be willing to confer with you or answer your questions.
Right.
I have a motion, Mr. President.
Okay, there's a motion to suspend consideration of the measure. Any objection? Hearing none. Consideration of the measure is suspended.
A minute suspension, Mr. President.
1 minute suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
With the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2909 under Committee Report number 203. This is the bill on Credit Surety Fund Cooperative, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we closed the period of committee amendments last September 16. I thus move that we open the period of individual amendment.
The period for individual amendments is in order on Senate Bill 2909.
I move that we recognize the sponsor, Senator Aquino.
Senator Bamakino is recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. President. I have a number of individual amendments
Please proceed.
for SBN 2909. On page 1, line 12, delete the
Page.
phrase
Yes.
special cooperatives to be known as. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection here? None approved.
On the same page, line 12, after the word cooperative, add the letter S to read as cooperatives. And there are two words on the same line to read as cooperatives, Mr. President.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 2, line 6, delete the phrase a special cooperative, comma, the.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 2, line 7, add the letter S to the word cooperative to read as cooperatives.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 2, line 8, delete the phrase and enjoy all the rights and privileges of cooperatives under Republic Act number 9520, comma, otherwise known as the Cooperative Code of 2008.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 2, Mr. President, line 10, delete the term member dash.
Any
Yes.
objection here? None approved.
On page 2, line 21, Mr. President, after the word act, add the phrase, comma, the following terms shall mean.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 2, line 22, Mr. President, delete the phrase shall refer to and replace it with a dash.
Any objection here? None approved.
On page 3, line 5, after the term member cooperatives, add punctuation mark slash and NGOs. The term shall now read as member cooperatives slash NGOs.
Any objection here? None approved.
On the same page, Mr. President, line 6, delete the phrase NGOs, GFIs, and LGUs and replace it with LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies.
How does this section now read?
It shall read as follows, Mr. President. Its members consist of the elected representatives of member cooperatives slash NGOs and the authorized representative slash S of LGUs, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies as independent directors with voting rights.
All right. Maybe instead of representative slash S, might it not be better if we say representative, open parenthesis, S, close parenthesis?
Definitely, Mr. President, we accept that amendment.
That's like, any objection here? Unapproved.
Mr. President, on page 3, line 24, after the term member cooperatives, add the punctuation mark slash NGOs.
Any objection? Unapproved.
On the same page, line 24, delete the phrase qualified NGOs, comma, GFIs, and LGUs, and replace it with the phrase LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies, Mr. President. Section 3G shall now read as follows. Letter G, Credit Surety Fund, in parenthesis CSF, dash, a fund generated from the contributions of well-capitalized and well-managed member cooperatives slash NGOs, comma, LGUs, comma, GFIs, comma, and other institutions slash government agencies, period. The CSF shall serve as security for the loans that will be obtained by qualified borrowers from lending banks by way of a surety cover issued by the Board of Directors of the CSF Cooperative in lieu of hard collaterals, period.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 4, line 1, delete the words a special and replace it with the article an LGU-partnered.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On the same page, line 2, after the term member cooperatives, add punctuation mark slash and then NGOs, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Next, Mr. President, on the same page, line 3, delete the phrase qualified NGOs, comma, GFIs, and LGUs, and replace it with the phrase LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies, comma.
How does it read now?
It will read as follows, Mr. President. This is the first paragraph of Section 3H. Credit Surety Fund Cooperative or CSF Cooperative dash an LGU partnered cooperative comprised of well-capitalized and well-managed member cooperatives slash NGOs that meet the criteria and qualifications prescribed by the CDA, comma, LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies, comma, all of which shall make contributions to the CSF as defined and prescribed by this Act. I so move, Mr. President. On page 4, line 27, delete the word "and", then replace this with the punctuation mark slash.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
On page 5, line 1, delete the phrase "or GFIs that want" and replace it with the phrase comma, GFIs and other institutions slash government agencies that opted.
How shall it read now?
It shall read as follows, Mr. President. Section 3K, investments dash the contributions of cooperatives slash NGOs to the CSF cooperative, which shall share in the earnings slash losses of the CSF in proportion to their contributions, period. It also includes contributions of the LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies, their contributions to be treated as investments. I so
Any
move, Mr.
objection?
President.
Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, on page 5, line 9, delete the article "and", then replace it with the punctuation mark slash. The term shall now read as member cooperatives slash NGOs.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 5, line 13, delete the words GFIs and LGUs and replace it with the phrase LGUs, comma, GFIs and other institutions slash government agencies, Mr. President.
Approved.
Article "and", then replace it with the punctuation mark slash. The term shall now read as member cooperatives slash NGOs.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 5, line 13, delete the words GFIs and LGUs and replace it with the phrase LGUs, comma, GFIs and other institutions slash government agencies, Mr. President.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 5, line 14, delete the phrase comma, adhering to the principles set forth in the Cooperative Code of 2008 and in the Articles of Cooperation, comma. Section 3N shall now read as follows. Members of the CSF Co-op. 1 second, may I get a 1-minute suspension,
1
Mr.
minute
President?
suspension.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, if I may continue my my individual amendment, it shall read as follows. Members of the CSF Co-op dash cooperatives, comma, NGOs, comma, LGUs, comma, GFIs, and other institutions slash government agencies that contributed to the CSF and who have been admitted by the CSF cooperative as its members. I so move, Mr. President.
Just a question of style. CSF Co-op, should
Yeah.
it not be CSF Cooperative?
That's right, Mr. If I can get 1 minute suspension, Mr.
Yes.
President. Ready to resume, Mr. President. Thank you for that, Mr. President. I also move that we, on that section, we change co-op to cooperative as a matter of style.
Matter of time.
Thank you, Mr.
Any
President.
objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, on page 6, line 13, we insert a new subsection Q, which shall read as follows. Letter Q, in parenthesis, other institutions slash government agencies, dash. Any institution, comma, public or private, comma, and government agency that contributes to the CSF either in the form of investment or special contribution, period.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, we also move that the subsequent subsections are relettered accordingly.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 6, line 14, delete the term cooperative member and replace it with member cooperative, member-cooperative, Mr. President.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 6, line 15, delete the article A and replace it with the article an.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Mr. President, on page 6, delete the definition of special contribution from lines 19 to 21 and replace it with the following definition. Special contribution, dash. Contributions of LGUs, GFIs, and other institutions / government agencies which shall be considered as a special grant, period. Like investments, these grants shall share proportionately in the earnings and losses of the fund, but earnings accruing thereto shall remain therein and cannot be distributed as dividends to allow the fund to grow, period. I so move, Mr. President.
Yes, before we approve, a matter of style, can we just delete the phrase like investments? Why don't we just go straight and say these grants shall share proportionately, etc.? Why is there a cross-reference to investments?
I accede to the wisdom of the presiding officer, Mr. President. We can delete the two words like investments and start the sentence with these.
These grants.
I so move, Mr. President.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 7, line 13, delete the words a special and replace it with the phrase an LGU-partnered.
Approved.
On the same page, Mr. President, line 13, delete the phrase the Cooperative Code of 2008 end. So the first paragraph of Section 5 shall now read as follows. Credit Surety Fund Cooperative or CSF Cooperative, dash, the CSF Cooperative shall be organized as an LGU-partnered cooperative in accordance with the implementing rules and regulations to be promulgated by the CDA.
Approved.
On page 8, deletes lines 6 and 7, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 8, line 8, insert a new Section 9 to read as follows, Mr. President. Section 9, taxation of CSF cooperatives, dash. Notwithstanding its registration with the CDA, a credit surety fund LGU-partnered cooperative shall be subject to regular taxes applicable to any and all of its incomes, semicolon, provided that member cooperatives of the CSF cooperative shall continue to be governed by the existing tax treatment under Republic Act No. 9520, otherwise known as the Philippine Cooperative Code of 2008, and CDA's existing rules and regulations, Mr. President. I so move.
Any objection? Hearing approved.
Mr. President, I also move to renumber the subsequent sections.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 8, line 9, after the term member cooperatives, add punctuation mark / and then NGOs. So the term shall now read as member cooperatives / NGOs.
Approved.
On page 8, line 12, delete the word from and replace it with the word of.
Any objection or none? Approved.
On the same page, line 12, delete the phrase LGUs, NGOs, and GFIs and replace it with the phrase LGUs, GFIs, and other institutions / government agencies, Mr. President. On page 9, line 7, delete the phrase in behalf of the CSF in all transactions to which and replace it with the phrase in cases involving.
Approved.
On the same page, line 7, delete the words is involved. Subsection F shall now read as follows, Mr. President. Sue and be sued in cases involving the CSF, semicolon.
Approved.
Mr. President, on page 9, line 26, delete the phrase notwithstanding the provisions of Republic Act No. 9520, The sentence shall now begin with the article at.
Approved.
On page 10, line 9, after the term member cooperatives, add the punctuation mark / and then NGOs, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 10, line 9, delete the words NGOs and MFIs and replace it with the phrase GFIs and other institutions / government agencies.
Approved.
On page 10, line 16, delete the phrase member cooperatives and NGOs and replace it with the term member cooperatives / NGOs, Mr. President.
Approved.
On page 10, line 18, after the word GFIs, add the phrase "and other institutions/government agencies."
Approved.
On page 10, line 20, after the word GFIs, add the phrase "and other institutions/government agencies."
Approved.
On page 10, line 23, delete the article "and", then replace it with the punctuation mark /, so the term shall now read as "member cooperatives/NGOs."
Approved.
On page 10, line 26, delete the article "and", then replace it with the punctuation mark /, so the term shall now read as "member cooperatives/NGOs."
Approved.
On page 11, line 1, after the word GFIs, add the phrase "and other institutions/government agencies."
Approved.
On page 11, line 2, delete the article "and", then replace it with the punctuation mark /. The term shall now read as "member cooperatives/NGOs."
Approved.
On page 11, line 3, after the term "member cooperatives", add punctuation mark /, then "NGOs", so the term shall now read as "member cooperatives/NGOs."
Approved.
On page 11, line 4, after the word GFIs, add the phrase "and other institutions/government agencies."
Approved.
On page 11, line 15, insert a new section 16 to read as follows. Section 16, maximum loan availment dash. The maximum amount that may be borrowed by qualified borrowers under the program shall not exceed 10 times its contributions to the fund at any given time, period.
Approved.
The subsequent sections, Mr. President, I move that we renumber them accordingly.
Approved.
On page 11, line 16, delete the word "or", then replace it with the punctuation mark /, so the term shall now read as "member cooperatives/NGOs."
Approved.
On page 12, line 6, delete the phrase "implementing the provisions."
Approved.
On page 12, after line 21, add a new number 6 to read as follows. Number 6, in parenthesis, submit an annual status report of each CSF to the Department. Mr. President, may I have a 1-minute suspension?
1 minute suspension.
Sir, CSF yung sila CDA.
No, but today it's the cooperative.
Apoy.
Ready to issue, Mr. President.
Hold on.
Ready to issue, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, let me restate number 6 on page 12 after line 21. Number 6, in parenthesis, submit an annual status report of each CSF cooperative to the Department of Finance and the Banco Central. I so move, Mr. President.
Just a question. How many CSF are there? You delude the DOF and the BSP with annual status reports?
Mr. President, it's part of the CDA's work to collate the performance of the CSFs anyway, Mr.
Alright,
President.
just
Yes, Mr.
a matter of record.
Yes.
All right. Any objection here? Not approved.
On page 14, line 4, Mr. President, delete the phrase comma, Republic Act number 9520, and this acts in apostrophe S, and replace it with the word ITS. ITS.
Approved.
On page 14, line 12, delete the word to and delete parenthesis 2.
Approved.
Lastly, Mr. President, on page 14, line 12, delete the last letter S found in the word newspapers to read simply as newspaper.
So can you read it now, Mr. Sponsor?
Yes, Mr. President.
I mean, the last amendment.
Yes. This act shall take effect 15 days after its publication in the official gazette or in a newspaper of general circulation. So if we can maybe replace newspapers with a newspaper.
All the laws that we have enacted which requires publication would usually require a publication in 2 newspapers of general circulation. Is there anything that...
No, Mr. President, let me just withdraw that last amendment,
Yes.
and we can just keep Section 26 as is. Mr. President, that's all. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Yes, the Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 29, report number 203.
Now the sponsor, who is recognized now as the acting Majority Leader, has moved that. What is the motion? To close?
To suspend...
To close the period of
yes, Mr.
amendment?
President. I move that we close the period of individual amendments.
All right. Period for individual amendments is closed.
Closed. Now, Mr. President, I
Is
move
there-
that we
okay.
suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2909 under committee report
Is there
number
any
203.
objection to the approval of this measure on second reading?
Mr.
Are
President.
there other amendments? Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Senator Soto,
Monday.
are there amendments coming?
No, Mr. President, but you were closing the period of individual amendments. or
That's correct.
committee amendments.
Yes.
I have no objection.
You have no objection.
Mr. President, the member of the minority and I spoke earlier, and they would like to have a clean copy on
All
Monday.
right. I did know that. All right.
Before passage
All
of
right,
second
fine.
reading,
Yeah.
individual amendments, I will have no problem.
Well, because we were just thinking that Monday might be the last day after the 3-day requirement for
It's all right,
pending.
Mr. President.
Yes, I understand
Is it
that.
possible, Senator
if we
Soto?
pass it on second reading on Monday, will it not fall in the 3-day rule by
Yes.
Wednesday?
It might be difficult. May I suggest
All right.
this? May I suggest, Mr. Senator Soto, we approve it on second reading without prejudice to your reopening the or to your reconsideration of the approval on second reading after you see the printed copy, and we will reconsider on second reading to check it.
That is a very good suggestion, Mr. President. I am seduced to accept it. But you see, the problem is if I find something on Monday, then we miss the 3-day rule. I have a
Yes.
better suggestion, Mr. President.
Yes, then
Give me 15 minutes and give me a
okay.
copy of the amendments, and I will look it over quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
So in the
consideration
meantime,
of the measure is suspended.
yes.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Pahingi ano mo?
Mr. President, ready to resume.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2923 under Committee Report number 215. This is the bill on anti-agricultural smuggling, Mr. President.
Any objection to the consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we closed the period of committee amendments last September 14. I thus move that we open the period of individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments is in order.
Mr. President, I move that we recognize a sponsor, Senator Villar,
Senator Villar is recognized on the period of individual amendments.
and that we recognize her to sponsor her own individual amendments, Mr. President.
Senator Villar is so recognized.
Mr. President, based on our consultation with the Office of the Senate President, we have come up with amendments to Senate Bill 2923 or the Anti-Agricultural Smuggling Act of 2015 as follows. On page 1, line 3, delete the phrase protect and I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection here, none approved.
On the same page, line 4, between the words and farmers, insert the phrase to protect. I so move, Mr.
Any
President.
objection here, none approved.
Still on the same page, line 7, delete the phrase thereby threatens. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection here, none.
Now, as agreed upon with the Office of the Senate President for conciseness and as a matter of policy that we refrain from using the nomenclature of the revised penal code in prescribing penalties in special laws, we are arranging the presentation of the declaration of the crime of large-scale agricultural smuggling, its elements, as well as the corresponding penalties. May I therefore propose that starting from page 1, line 12, up to page 7, line 27, we delete sections 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, and in lieu thereof, we are providing new sections 3 and 4. Sections 3 and 4 read as follows. Section 3, large-scale agricultural smuggling as economic sabotage. The crime of large-scale agricultural smuggling as economic sabotage involving sugar, corn, pork, poultry, garlic, onion, carrots, fish, and cruciferous vegetable in its raw state or which have undergone the simple processes of preparation or preservation for the market with a minimum amount of 1 million pesos or rice with a minimum amount of 10 million pesos as valued by the Bureau of Customs is committed through any of the following act: importing or bringing into Philippines without the required import permit from the regulatory agency, using import
Letter B.
permits.
Can we say letter A and letter B? Madam
Okay,
Sponsor?
letter A, importing or bringing into the Philippines without the required import permit from the regulatory agencies. B, using import permits of person, natural, or juridical other than those specifically named in the permit. C, using fake, fictitious, or fraudulent import permits or shipping documents. D, selling, lending, leasing, assigning, consenting, or allowing the use of import permits of corporations, non-government organizations, cooperatives, associations, or single proprietorships by other persons. E, misclassification, undervaluation, or misdeclaration upon the filing of import permit and revenue declaration with the Bureau of Customs in order to evade the payment of rightful taxes and duties due to the government. F, organizing or using dummy corporations, non-government organizations, associations, cooperatives, or single proprietorships for the purpose of acquiring import permits. G, transporting or storing the agricultural product subject to economic sabotage regardless of quantity. Or H, acting as broker of the violating importer. Section 4, penalties. A, the penalty of life imprisonment and a fine of twice the fair value of the smuggled agricultural product, and the aggregate amount of the taxes, duties, and other charges avoided shall be imposed on any person who commits any acts enumerated under Section 3 of this Act. B, the penalty of imprisonment of not less than 17 years but not more than 20 years, and a fine of twice the fair value of the smuggled agricultural product, and the aggregate amount of taxes, duties, and other charges avoided shall be imposed on the officers, dummy corporations, non-government organizations, associations, cooperatives, or single proprietorship who knowingly sell, lend, lease, assign, consent, or allow the unauthorized use of their import permits for purposes of smuggling. C, the penalty of imprisonment of not less than 14 years but not more than 17 years, and a fine equal to the fair value of the smuggled agricultural product, and the aggregate amount of the taxes, duties, and other charges avoided shall be imposed on the following: the registered owner and its lessee or charterer in case of lease of a chartered boat, motorized commercial vessel of more than 3 gross tonnage who knowingly transports the agricultural product subject to economic sabotage regardless of quantity. 2, the registered owner and its lessee in case of lease of 6 or more wheeler trucks, vans, and other means of transportation who knowingly transports the agricultural product subject to economic sabotage regardless of quantity. 3, the registered owner or lessee of a warehouse or any property who knowingly stored the smuggled agricultural product subject to economic sabotage. Or 4, the registered owner, lessee, president, or chief executive officer of the private port, fish landing sites, resorts, airports, who knowingly allows the agricultural product to be smuggled into the country. And D, the penalty of imprisonment of not less than 12 years but not more than 14 years, and a fine equal to the fair value of the smuggled agricultural product subject to economic sabotage, and the aggregate amount of the taxes, duties, and other charges avoided shall be imposed on the following: The registered owner, its lessee or charterer in case of lease of a chartered boat, motorized commercial vessel of 3 gross tonnage or less, who knowingly transports the agricultural product subject to economic sabotage regardless of quantity. Or 2, the registered owner and its lessee in case of lease or less than 6-wheeler trucks, vans, and other means of transportation, who knowingly transports the agricultural product subject to economic sabotage regardless of quantity. In all cases, the smuggled agricultural product shall be confiscated and the property used in agricultural smuggling consistent with Section 2530 of the Tariff and Customs Codes and without prejudice to Section 2531 of the same code shall be forfeited in favor of the government. When the offender is a juridical person, criminal liability shall attach to its president, chief operating officer, or manager who consents to or knowingly tolerates the commission of the prohibited crime. Any person, natural or juridical, found guilty under this act shall also suffer the penalty of perpetual absolute disqualification to engage in any business involving importation. In applying the above-mentioned penalties, if the offender is an alien and prescribed penalty is not life imprisonment, he shall be deported upon serving the sentence without further proceedings for deportation. If the offender is a government official or employee, the penalty shall be the maximum as here above prescribed, and the offender shall suffer an additional penalty or perpetual disqualification from public office to vote and to participate in any public election. I so move, Mr. President.
Before we act on the motion, just a typographical correction on Section 4, Paragraph C, III. The provision reads: the registered owner and lessee of a warehouse or any property who knowingly stores, not store, who knowingly stores the smuggled agricultural product subject to economic sabotage. Just add the S.
Yeah, I accept your amendment,
Now,
Mr. President.
again, just for the record, the values on Section 3, we asked this before, but just for the record, the minimum amount of 1 million or rise with a minimum amount of 10 million pesos. This is per shipment, Senator?
Yes, per shipment.
Per shipment. Now, may I ask the question, what if these smugglers would split and value it exactly at 900,000, or in the case of rice, less than 10 million, are they not liable for some crime?
Yeah, they are liable under the tariff code.
Not under this law.
Not under this law.
Under the tariff code.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much. So, with those clarifications, there's a motion that the amendment to that the new Section 3 as read and Section 4 as read be approved. Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Okay. Number 5 on pages 7 and 8, we renumber sections 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, and 16 as section 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, respectively. I so move, Mr. President.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Number 6 on page 8, lines 8 to 11, delete the entire sentence starting with the word "the," and in lieu thereof, insert a new sentence to read as follows. If any portion of this act is declared unconstitutional or invalid, the portions or provisions which are not affected shall continue to be in full force and effect.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
7, lastly, on the same page, lines 15 and 16, delete the phrase "immediately upon its approval," and in lieu thereof, insert the phrase "after 15 days following its publication in the official gazette or in 2 newspapers of general circulation." That will be all, Mr. President.
In 2 newspapers of general circulation. Any objection? Hearing none, approved. Thank you, Senator Villar.
Mr. President, I move that we close the period of individual amendments.
Period for individual amendments terminated.
Mr. President, I move that we
Pass on second
consider
reading.
this on second reading, Mr.
Yes.
President. I call for a second reading vote, Mr. President.
All right. There are no other individual amendments submitted to the floor or to the sponsor of the measure. There being none, we reiterate the closure of the period of individual amendments upon motion. The Senate Bill 2923 is hereby approved on second reading.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2923 under Committee Report number 215.
So suspended.
Mr. President, I want to accept I want to be interpolated on the SSS bill by the Senate President so we can finish it today.
Well, we are not prepared at this point to. On the
Because, Mr.
interpolation.
President, I have to go to UNFAO and the Anuga Fair next week. So I was hoping we can finish it before we...
We regret that we are not prepared. We were prepared next week.
I won't be here next week, Mr.
We
President.
can take it up when we come back in November.
Okay, Mr. President. Thank you very much.
All right, Mr. President, with the consent of the Senate, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2952 under Committee Report number 254. This is the bill on uniformed personnel educational assistance and benefits, Mr. President.
Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, the parliamentary status of the measure is that we have actually closed the period of individual amendments yesterday, if I'm not mistaken.
Can the Secretary confirm that?
No? Okay. Mr. President, we are still in the period of individual amendments, and I thus move that we recognize the sponsor, Senator Soto.
Senator Soto is recognized.
Mr. President, no other member of the Senate actually yet.
Senator Soto? 1 minute lang, Senator. Which one? Which one? No, there were amendments. We were raising, we were asking him on that use of income. We suspend for 1 minute with the permission of the chamber. Sorry? Yeah, because I was just asking whether or not session is resumed. Senators, the principal sponsor, Senator Soto, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, yesterday, before I continue, what is the parliamentary status? We are...
Mr. President, we're
taking
still
it
in
up.
the period of
Bill
individual
of
amendments. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. All right. Yesterday, I introduced 4 individual amendments on Senate Bill 2952. However, the chamber only approved 3 out of the 4. This is due to the request of the Senate President to hold the abeyance the approval of one of the amendments that will include income derived from the firearms license fees as one of the sources of funds for the scholarship program of Senate Bill 2952. After a careful study on the subject special provision under 2015 GAA, we found out that the budget of the PNP, BJMP, AFP, and BFP, particularly provides respective special provisions on the use of income, which reads, DILG, Bureau of Fire Protection, page 1237. Sabi ng number 2 nila. Firearms license fees, 20% net proceeds of the firearms license fees deposited with the National Treasury as trust receipts pursuant to DBM DILG Joint Circular 192, dated May 8, 1992, EO 338, 1996, shall be used for the scholarship privileges to surviving children of deceased or permanently incapacitated firemen in accordance with Republic Act 6963. DILG naman, special provisions then, Mr. President, on firearms license fees. 10% net proceeds of the firearms license fees deposited with the National Treasury as trust receipts pursuant to DBM DILG Circular, so on and so forth. 2016 National Expenditure Program, Department of the Interior and Local Government, page 287, special provision, number 2, trust receipts from police fees and charges, fees and charges collected by the PNP by virtue of its absorption of then Philippine Constabulary Integrated National Police and AFP units and recorded as trust receipts shall be used as follows. Letter B, 40% net proceeds of the firearms license fees recorded as trust receipts shall be used for the scholarship privileges to surviving children of deceased or permanently incapacitated police officers in accordance with Republic Act 6963. This shows, Mr. President, that the proceeds of the license fees for our firearms collected by the PNP has been the exclusive source of Republic Act 6963, or the law granting financial and benefits to the family of or beneficiary of any police, military, or fireman killed and incapacitated while in the performance of his duties, as permitted by the GAA. One of these benefits is scholarship for the beneficiaries. This is actually the law that Senate Bill 2952 is amending. Thus, the special provision on the use of income that the Senate President was mentioning is therefore consistent with our proposed amendments, Mr. President. So, with that, may I again call for the proposed amendment. It was laid on the table. So, if I may reiterate and call it back to the floor. Page 3, Section 7, line 18, between the words from and savings, insert the phrase proceeds of the license fees for firearms collected by the PNP.
Any objection? Hearing none, approved.
Thank you, Mr. President. That is all.
Mr. President, no other senator indicated their intention for individual amendments, so I move that we close the period of individual amendments.
So closed.
Mr. President, I move that we consider this bill on second reading.
There's a motion that we approve we approve on second reading. Senate Bill 2952. Any objection? Hearing none. Senate Bill 2952 is approved on second reading.
A 1 minute suspension, Mr.
Can
President.
we move to suspend consideration of the measure first?
Of course, Mr. President. I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2952 under Committee Report number 254.
So suspended. 1 minute suspension upon the motion of the
Mr.
majority.
President, I withdraw that motion.
All right.
Mr. President, I move that we resume consideration of Senate Bill number 2909 under Committee Report number 203. This is the Credit Surety Fund Cooperative Bill, Mr.
Huh?
President.
Sorry? Okay. Consideration of the measure is in order.
Mr. President, we closed the period of individual amendments already, so I move that we consider Senate Bill number 2909 under Committee Report number 203 on second reading.
The acting minority leader had earlier manifested that he was going to go over the measure as amended. May we now know the pleasure of the acting minority leader?
Yes, Mr. President, I went over the measure and checked on my records. We had a conversation with those who originally proposed the measure, and I think there is just one question that I want answered, if it's all right.
Please proceed.
Before we
Yes.
approve it on second reading. There is an introduction of a new section. The taxation of CSF cooperatives. May I be clarified? This was not originally in the original bill, Mr. President.
Yes, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Department of Finance insisted that we have that clarificatory section inserted to be able to make clear the tax regime for the CSF cooperative. Because, Mr. President, even though we call it a CSF cooperative, it shall not have the same rights and benefits from the Cooperative Code of 2008. So it shall be under the regular tax regime, Mr. President. So our friends from the Department of Finance wanted to clarify that, and our friends from the BSP acceded to that, Mr. President.
Reiterating that it is governed by the existing tax treatment.
It does not fall under the tax treatment of the Cooperative Code of 2008, Mr. President.
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. I am clarified. I have no objections in the passage.
All right. There's a motion that Senate Bill 2909 under Committee Report 203 be approved on second reading. Any objection? Hearing none. Carried.
Mr. President, I move that we suspend consideration of Senate Bill number 2909 under Committee Report number 203.
So suspended.
1 minute suspension, Mr.
1
President.
minute suspension.
Sila eh. Opo, parang
Okay. Sige.
Ready to resume, Mr. President.
Session is resumed.
Mr. President, I move that we adjourn the session until 3 o'clock. Yes, Mr. President.
Senator
President.
Soto.
Sorry, Mr. President.
You don't have to
was not aware
apologize.
that. No, but I would just like manifest that Senator Cynthia Villar be made a co-author of the bill that we just passed on second reading on the educational benefits.
This is Senate Bill 2952.
2952. Yes, Mr. President.
All right. Make of record that Senator Villar is a co-author of Senate Bill 2952.
I move to adjourn, Mr. President, until 3 o'clock on October 5, 2015.
Session is adjourned until 3 o'clock in the afternoon of October 5, 2015.